Hello, I'm Rachel Steinlicht, and my report is on Georg Philipp Telemann. Georg Philipp Telemann was a German composer of the late Baroque period. During his life, he was the most celebrated composer in Germany and was renowned throughout Europe. He had a contemporary reputation much greater than Bach did, but he fell into disregard shortly after his death. He wrote an enormous amount of music during his life and contributed to all the main forms of the period, with operas, cantatas, masses, passions, orchestral and chamber music, and songs. Although his music has often been considered purely superficial and written to order, lately musicologists have begun to recognize the impact that Telemann had on music, especially in the fields of music publishing, music education, and theory. Telemann was born in Magdeburg on March 14, 1681. He showed intense interest in music from an early age, mastering the violin, flute, zither, and keyboard instruments by the age of 10, and composing an opera just 2 years later. His mother was worried that Telemann was headed toward the unprofitable profession of music and attempted to steer his interests in other directions. She even went so far as to remove his musical instruments and forbid him from participating in any musical societies. But that didn't last very long. In 1701 he entered Leipzig University with the intent of studying law, but by 1702 he had organized a student collegium musicum at the university and had been appointed music director of the Leipzig Opera, where he used students in positions. He was appointed organist of the new church, which was St. Matthew's, in 1704, but he left the position to move to Sorau as Kapellmeister to Count Prominence. From 1708 to 1712, Telemann worked as concertmeister for the court of Duke Johann Wilhelm of Saxe-Eisenach. His own account states that he wrote a huge amount of vocal music, including 4 or 5 complete annual cycles of cantatas, in addition to a couple incomplete cycles, numerous masses, psalms, other sacred works, and 50 German and Italian cantatas. Now, that's his own writing, so we're not exactly sure if that was all written during that time, but it's very possible because he wrote incredibly quickly. He also wrote a huge amount of instrumental music during this time, including concertos and sonatas. After this, he moved to Frankfurt in 1712, where he would stay until his appointment in 1721 as cantor of the Johannum Lateinschule and municipal music director in Hamburg, where he would stay for the rest of his life. This was the most important post for Telemann, and he stayed here the longest. But he ran into trouble during his very first year in Hamburg. The city attempted to prevent his taking part in operatic performances, and in retaliation Telemann applied for the vacant post of cantor at the Thomaskirche in Leipzig. He was chosen in preference to J.S. Bach, but Hamburg retained him by increasing his salary and appointing him music director of the opera. After this had all gotten settled down, he entered into the most productive portion of his career. Each week he was expected to provide 2 new cantatas and a new passion every year for Lent. Music was required for induction ceremonies, church consecrations, and for the city's numerous civic celebrations. As cantor, he was responsible for instructing schoolboys in singing, theory, and music history, but these official duties did not prevent him from giving public concerts and directing Collegium Musicum. He stayed in Hamburg until his death in 1767. One of Telemann's most lasting accomplishments was the volume of music that he published himself. In the 15 years from 1725 to 1740 he brought out 43 publications, and all but one was under his own imprint. Telemann himself engraved the plates, and he took full responsibility for advertising and soliciting advance subscriptions. Telemann composed a wide variety of music, but there are a few defining characteristics to his music. He typically avoided extremes of technical difficulty in his music to encourage the widest spread of his work. This worked really well, and many of his publications found favor both in private homes and in Germany's courts, so being played by amateurs as well as the top musicians of the day. He also adopted German tempo, dynamic, and expression markings in his vocal works, using many more German terms than the standard Italian terms. I think it's interesting that during the 18th century, critics were practically unanimous in counting Telemann among the best composers of his time. He was compared favorably to both composers of his own generation, such as Bach and Handel, as well as the succeeding generation. But after the 18th century, critics began to undermine Telemann's reputation. It is true that many of his works sound similar to one another, and they don't contain the complexity of Bach's music, but they still are quite delightful. Due to the comparatively lower difficulty of many of his works, they are still popular for student literature. Some of his concertos, such as the Viola Concerto in G major and his fantasias for flute and violin, are still performed regularly today. So, in conclusion, Georg Philipp Telemann enjoyed incredible success during his life and composed an astounding amount of music, more than 3,000 pieces. Although his works may not be the most complex and interesting works during the Baroque period, Telemann was looking ahead and paving the way for the melody-driven classical era. Telemann has almost disappeared from the history books, but I believe that historians should take a closer look at his music and the impact that he had on society. He was wildly popular during his time, and I believe that he was popular for a reason. So, that's my presentation. Thank you very much.